My name is Paul Héroux. I am the Vice Chair of the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation, and I also teach toxicology and health effects of electromagnetic radiation at McGill University. If you have been listening to this podcast by Dr. Stein, you have been instructed on a variety of methods to protect yourself against this electromagnetic environment in our midst that is increasing all the time. No, these cell phones and these cell phone towers are not inoffensive. In other words, the radiation that they emit are biologically active, and in the short term, if you have are electrosensitive person, or in the long term, if you are a completely normal person, exposure to this radiation can affect your health. And of course, you have to worry the most about chronic effects like diabetes or diseases of the nervous system like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis.
Welcome to the Dr. Eleanor Stein Podcast. In this show, you will hear expert medical professionals, researchers, and people with lived experience share science-based, low to no cost strategies to help people with complex chronic diseases. Listen in for another dose of education, empowerment, and hope. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Ellie Stein. Welcome to the Dr. Eleanor Stein Podcast. My topic today is about an environmental toxin we are all exposed to in ever-increasing amounts, an exposure that is proven to have diverse and serious negative effects on health, and is something we can influence but we cannot control. We can't see it, hear it, or feel it. So what we do is we cross our fingers, sometimes put our head in the sand and hope that it isn't there, or hope that if it is there, it won't negatively affect us. Are you curious what I'm talking about? I'm talking about electromagnetic radiation, both the very low frequency radiation from electricity and the high frequency radiation from wireless transmission. I have been aware of the science around the dangers of EMF for over 25 years. I've been to a lot of conferences about it, and I've done extensive mitigation of my own house and in my own life. And it's puzzled me that for 25 years, I'm a physician, I've been in practice for 35 years, and people are willing to go to extreme lengths to change their diet, to purchase supplements, to undergo expensive and risky medical procedures, but they're just not willing to give up their cell phone or their other wireless devices, even at night when they're asleep and they don't need them. I have presented other webinars on this topic in the past, and I've been searching for some time for someone who's a real expert in the field, who has the scientific credentials and the ability to explain in everyday language the risks involved with EMF and, perhaps more importantly, what we can do to protect ourselves. I recently heard Dr. Paul Héroux talk at a Canadian conference, and I immediately knew he was someone who I wanted to introduce to you, the community of people with complex chronic diseases. In the live sessions that I do with the community, I have been talking about EMF for some time, and many people have taken to heart the information and are decreasing their exposure and are feeling better. So if you're someone who experiences poorer health than you would like, this episode could provide you with a missing link for improved health. Dr. Paul Héroux is a scientist with training and experience in physics, engineering, and health sciences. Following his basic science and engineering training, he became interested in public health research. He is a professor at McGill University, where he teaches the principles of toxicology, the health effects of electromagnetism, and also hearing conservation. And in addition to his academic role, he's also worked at various times for industry, including l'Institut de Recherche de Hydro-Québec, so Hydro-Québec, the Canadian Electrical Association, the U.S. Electric Power Research Institute, and even telecommunications companies like Nortel and Siemens. So he's really has a great balanced perspective from both the scientific perspective and understanding the needs of the telecommunication industry. Most recently, he was a member of the New Hampshire Commission to study the environmental and health effects of evolving 5G technology, something that I'm definitely going to be asking him about. And he is a commissioner since 2022 and the vice chair of the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. So he comes very well educated and recommended. So, Dr. Héroux, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your expertise with the community.
The pleasure.
I'm going to start by asking you how you got interested in the field of non-native EMF and human health.
Well, this field became important for companies, and it started with power companies because power companies obviously have power lines and they distribute electricity into our homes through wiring that also exudes electric and magnetic fields. So the power industry was the first to be, I would say, solicited with this problem. But over the years, we have developed telecommunication systems that are not only through wiring, but also through wireless. So what this means is that another very, very important problem was about the effect of this wireless medium. In other words, electromagnetic waves that propagate through space that allow us to communicate over even long distances, I mean, over the Atlantic and so on. So this became a very, very important technique of communications, and it was recognized to be absolutely essential in times of war, which means that the military had a absolutely crying need to not only use these telecommunications on the battlefields, but also to have what is called electromagnetic dominance, which means that if you are sitting in an F-16 and you are opposing an enemy fighter, your wish is that you have a better radar and that you can jam the opponent's telecommunications. So you understand that in this context, there has been a great deal of motivation practically for all nations to use wireless techniques to their utmost. What this has resulted in is in views on non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation that were extremely non-protective of the public, because essentially in the minds of high-level politicians, it was essential to develop as rapidly as possible all the tools that allow use of electromagnetic radiation in the battlefields and even in society, as the deployment of cellular phones has been an enormous success. So, of course, we had first electrification of society. Who is to deny that this was an enormous progress? And second, we had the proliferation of all sorts of radio frequencies, either in broadcasting for radio, television, and then for cellular networks. So we are now surrounded with a small monster or a big monster, depending on how you want to view it.
And how is it a monster? So maybe just to dive right in, how does it harm us? How does it affect us?
Well, both the electrical industry and the telecommunications industry had a very, very vital interest in downplaying any risks of electromagnetic radiation because they knew that it would make their life, the exploitation of their networks, more complicated. You might recall situations where an electrical utility wants to upgrade or to install a new power line through a community, and the people in that community oppose this installation on the basis that the magnetic fields coming from the line might have biological effects. This is a very, very typical situation. Now, the effect that came out most hastily from these magnetic fields is childhood leukemia. Childhood leukemia, well, leukemias are cancers that come out fairly rapidly when you have a chemical or a physical agent that is active, because immune system cells live very dangerous lives, and the bone marrow is fragile, dividing very, very quickly. And so consequently, it is something that is fragile. So basically, the arguments surrounding power lines surrounded leukemia. When we talk about other types of radiation that are non-ionizing, like telecommunications radiation, and this became very, very acute in the case of cellular phones, because after all, a cellular phone does not communicate with another cellular phone through magic. What it does is that it emits radiation, and this radiation is picked up by a tower that usually relays the information using fiber optics to another tower, who then relays it to the person that you are communicating with. So what this means is that we have in our hands, I'm sorry, I don't have a cell phone with me, so I can show you a calculator that has about the same size. And of course, when you place this against your head, what you're doing, essentially, you probably think that you're sending a signal out from the unit, but actually only 7% of the signal makes it in the form of useful telecommunications. The rest is absorbed by your head, your brain, and your hand. So what this means is that you are microwaving yourself. And since this cell phone is very close to your head, the doses that you are getting are relatively high. It's not the same as being in a microwave oven, but it is well documented that after issuing a call, the temperature on the surface and in your head is altered from the microwaves. So what does this mean in practice? Well, in the case of the power lines, industry decided that the only effects that they would recognize were those like electrocution. We've all heard of that, right? You don't put your fingers on high voltage wires, and of short electric shocks. Those are effects that are so familiar that there was no possibility that industry could evade public consciousness on these problems. But they wanted to limit the recognized health effects to those. So things like magnetic fields surrounding power lines, or the network in your own house being active enough to generate leukemia in children, is something that they fought completely. They felt that it was impossible, and they said openly that physics precludes these effects from happening. In the case of telecommunications, they did exactly the same thing. They said, well, the only recognized effect of this radiation will be its heating effect. If it does not heat your body more than 1 degree centigrade or 1 Kelvin, if you wish, then there is no effect of the radiation. And they based these principles on very, very simple physics. They said, since it is non-ionizing radiation, it does not ionize your body, and so there is no possible mechanism of interaction with which health effects could occur. And they said also this radiation is much too weak in the sense that it cannot compete with the thermal energy of water molecules in your body. So consequently, it cannot affect you. And lastly, they said there is no mechanism by which these effects could occur. Unfortunately, all three of these things were false. And they were false when they were, I would say, stated, but industry did not want to explore further for want of essentially shooting itself in the foot. In other words, if they had admitted to these effects, they would have had morally to be more cautious about exposing people either through low frequency radiation or radio frequency waves. So they restricted the discussion to very, very narrow grounds.
And can you explain a little bit more about how electromagnetic radiation affects our cells, like why these three statements
Principles are wrong.
Why they're wrong? Yeah.
Well, industry has a view of a person as water, salt, and sugar together. And they believe that this describes a living being. So when they test a cell phone, they take the cell phone and they bring it near a solution and they assess how heated up the solution is. And they say if it doesn't heat more than a certain amount, then it's okay. The unfortunate problem with people is that they're alive. When they're alive, what it means is that they have cells that metabolize. And it's very surprising or unsurprising. Industry never went that far in their thinking. When your cell is alive, it needs to activate certain reactions to stay alive. And for this purpose, it needs to produce a fuel that we call ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is the currency, the energy currency of the cells. Okay, to stay alive, you need ATP. You generate your own weight in ATP every day. This is a molecule that is recycled continuously, and you need it to stay alive. So how is ATP generated? It is generated in small organelles that we have in each cell, and not only in human cells, but in animal cells and in plant cells. Essentially, mitochondria generate ATP by using the energy, for example, in the case of humans, from food. You eat, the food is digested, it goes at the cellular level, and you also breathe. The oxygen is an electron acceptor. So basically, there is a reaction within mitochondria, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. In other words, we're oxidizing food to create energy. And this reaction depends, and this is a universal principle, on continuous motion of electrons and protons within the body. So what industry missed, unknowingly or knowingly, is the fact that when you're alive, you circulate these electric currents, and those are both currents of electrons and currents of protons continuously. If you stop these currents, we can do the experiment right now. All you have to do is plug your nose and close your mouth. And after 3 minutes, you will probably pass out because the oxygen doesn't go into your blood and is not at the cellular level present to accept these electrons. And consequently, the reaction that produces ATP stops. And within these 3 or 4 minutes, you will begin to have brain damage because the brain is the organ in the human body that is most acutely dependent on energy supply. So if you admit that in the human body, not only in the brain, this is where it is most acutely felt, but in all other tissues, you have currents that continuously flow, that are generated by the life's process. Then any other field that you add to this organism that penetrates the organism can interfere with this process. And this is what I demonstrated personally in my lab, using all the major cancer cells that afflict humans, that even at very, very low fields, you can disrupt these currents in cancer cells, which are a very good model to illustrate biological phenomena. Of course, the fields also affect normal cells, but in the laboratory, it's very convenient to use cancer cells. And what we could see in cancer cells is that when you apply electromagnetic radiation to the cells, you change the karyotype of the cancer cell. In other words, the number of chromosomes that the given cancer has is in general reduced, because when you have these fields that are superimposed on living, on the fields that are natural to life, well, the cell feels it has a smaller budget to generate chromosomes, and a cell that is cancerous can generate fewer chromosomes. And we found that if we removed the fields, the cancer cells would rebuild the normal number of chromosomes that is typical of that cell line. So we found, even at very low levels of magnetic fields, that there were obvious, clear effects on all human cancers. This is not good news, you know, if you're electrical utility and you tell all of your customers not to worry about the impacts of electromagnetic radiation. And essentially, the same principles apply to RF radiation. RF radiation is different in the sense that some frequencies, like say below 1 gigahertz, penetrate the body very easily. Whereas if you increase the frequency to high levels, like high band 5G, for example, the radiation is very rapidly absorbed in living tissues. Now, the absorption of electromagnetic radiation in living tissues is viewed in a very, very peculiar way by the industry. If you talk to telecommunications engineers, they'll say, you know, we're trying to develop new generations. This is what G means in 5G, fifth generation. We're trying to develop new generations of telecommunication systems that are more highly performing, and they have a great virtue in that this radiation penetrates less deeply in the human body. And if you have a simple approach to the situation, an engineer's approach, you'll say, well, this is great. The body is less affected since this radiation penetrates less deeply. But the fact that it is absorbed more rapidly simply means that it is concentrated in the skin. Engineers have a view of the skin as this layer, probably made of some sort of plastic, I don't know what. They don't acknowledge the fact that skin is alive and that the corpus callosum is a very, very thin layer. And so even when you state that high-frequency electromagnetic radiation is not penetrating, it does not mean that it does not interact with living cells. And one of the things that I don't like is the fact that our own government, the Canadian government, lies to us lavishly about this principle. I don't know if you've seen in airports these scanners that require the person to go inside the scanner and to lift their arms, and then you're surrounded.
Yeah, I've always wondered about those. So tell us,
Those function at the level of about 100 gigahertz, which means that this radiation,
oh my gosh,
is very, very non-penetrating. And in the view of an engineer, it's great. It only penetrates 2 or 3 millimeters inside the body. But this is totally ridiculous. The skin is in fact a living system, and all the radiation from these devices is deposited almost exclusively there. And the pamphlets that the government issues says things like the radiation goes around the body, trying to imply that there is no penetration, which is a blatant lie, both from a physical point of view and also a lie from potentially creating things like, skin cancers, like melanomas and things like that. So the government, in its desire to ensure airline safety, is perfectly happy to gloss over the truth over this radiation. And something more significant, in a sense, is that all life forms have one thing in common. They have water in them. And water is one of the main victims of electromagnetic radiation, both at low frequencies and at high frequencies. In the case of the high frequencies, for RF, when you increase the frequency for 5G and 6G and so on, you have a radiation that is more easily absorbed in water. But that means that it disturbs water more. To a biologist, that doesn't mean, to an engineer, that doesn't mean anything. But to a biologist, what this means is that the matrix of water upon which the biological systems rely are disturbed by this radiation. And I would say that life on Earth has appeared, not by chance. It has appeared because our sun, the one that shines in the sky, has radiation that is exceptionally non-perturbing to water. In other words, the water matrix under the sun that we have can be relied to be very, very stable. But when you add to our environment these new frequencies that absorb into the body, that can heat it up, then you disturb this matrix. And in my opinion, the water matrix has been important not only in the appearance of life over 3 billion years. We have enjoyed the sun that was fairly constant in intensity and had more or less the same color. And that has allowed life to evolve because there was a stable water matrix for that to occur. Now we have life on Earth, but we are contaminating the Earth with radiation that at a fundamental level is hostile to the water matrix. So a lot of people who are schooled in molecular biology will look for effects on biological molecules rather than effects on water. But the effects on water are very, very significant and important. Now, it doesn't mean that this radiation doesn't have an effect on other molecules. For example, you probably have heard of DNA. Well, this is the genetic code. And there are 2 strands in DNA, right, that are intertwined with one another. These 2 strands are stabilized by what we call hydrogen bonds. This is protons that oscillate between one strand and the other. And it's very well known that electromagnetic radiation in sufficient amounts can destabilize these bonds. And these bonds, hydrogen bonds, are also very important in the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure of proteins. The primary structure of proteins is through a sequence of amino acids, but all of the other, I would say, conformations are determined in great part by hydrogen bonds. So fundamentally, radiation that is able to change the movement of protons and electrons in our bodies are essentially hostile to the functions of biological organisms. And that is seen in humans, in animals, and in plants. And it's extremely surprising to me that industry could manage to convince the population of the earth, most of the population, or governments and agencies that are supposed to take care of our health, that radiation of this sort is innocuous. It is, to me, extraordinarily surprising. It is a feat of public relations.
And we're kind of like all sheep going along with it, all 9 billion of us, because almost everybody on Earth has access to electricity and almost everybody has access. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I sounded funny to myself. Has a cell phone. I'm wondering if I can just recap what I think you've said to make sure I've understood it. So you've basically explained how electromagnetic radiation, both the low frequency that's in electricity and the ever higher frequencies that we're being exposed to, affects basically like the basic tenets of what keeps us alive. It affects the flow of electrons.
Yeah.
It affects the flow of protons. It affects water. I'm going to maybe ask you a further question of how it does that or in what way it affects it. It affects the hydrogen bonds that keep our DNA together and give proteins the correct shape. And so basically, it affects mitochondria because mitochondrial function depends upon the flow of electrons and protons. I mean, it's kind of giving me a bit of a chill, like, how are we even still alive?
I would love to have you as a student. You get everything instantly.
Okay. Wow.
Well, the body is really well organized. When, for example, electromagnetic radiation is incident on the mitochondrion, the mitochondrion probably feels, oh my God, I'm generating a little less ATP because of this interference. Fortunately, in the body, there is a big enzyme called AMPK alpha, the enzyme monophosphate. It has a complex name, but what it does is that when there is a reduction in ATP supply, it shuts down some processes to make sure that it has enough ATP for other processes. So this is a master regulator. That means that our cells truly have an embedded mechanism to compensate for these variations. And so electromagnetic fields are not the only thing that can reduce the amount of ATP produced by a cell. Maybe there's not enough food, there's a famine. The cell has had to deal with these problems before, and it has a great system for doing so. The problem with electromagnetic radiation is that the human cell, for example, is primarily designed to deal with chemical agents, things that vary for one reason or another, but these agents vary relatively slowly. Electromagnetic radiation is very different in that it can be applied instantly and be stopped instantly. And basically, body systems have never seen an agent that is so aggressive. Now, you might ask me, why is it that we have become so resistant to the electromagnetic radiation from the sun? Because after all, that is electromagnetic radiation as well. Well, the answer to that is 3 billion years. In other words, life has had 3 billion years to invent itself in the context of the radiation that is typical of our sun. So the genius of life is to use energy that is spewed by the sun, energy that fundamentally could be destructive to living systems. It's used it for photosynthesis, which has, produced plants, and then animals came and ate these plants. And all of nature is based on the use of electromagnetic radiation to essentially advance life's agenda. But you realize we're not totally resistant to this radiation, even after 3 billion years. If you go to the beach and you stay in the sun too long, you will sunburn. So our adaptation is not complete, but adaptation has occurred over a very, very long period of time. And the same thing might happen with the non-natural electromagnetic radiation, except for the fact that this new player on the block, the radiation from power lines and telecommunication system, has happened suddenly over the last 100 years and sometimes over the last year. So it's extremely unlikely that we will be able to adapt so rapidly. And the truth is that the radiation from telecom systems is changing continuously, mostly by addition of new systems, new types of radiation that are layered one on top of the other. You might remember that in the past, we inaugurated AM radio. Remember the 850 kilohertz stations? And then we had FM radio, 88 point something megahertz. Those were continuous radiations. They resembled more or less sound waves, although they were at higher frequencies, but they were streams of the radiation that had very little interruption. It was an environment that was reasonably stable. Then digitization came along, and this great idea of digitization, which is essentially a technique to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. The reason why we use digitization is because it allows us to send signals with very little deterioration. Why? Because it's very easy to distinguish a 0 from a 1.
So I see. There's nothing in between.
That's right. So this practical aspect became so popular in engineering circles that practically everything now is digitized. And so it means that even the transmission of data or voice that used to be done with amplitude modulation, with radio and frequency modulation, and even television, has now become digitized. And to manage most economically the bandwidth that is assigned to telecommunication systems, well, they send data in very short bursts. In other words, nothing happens for a while. And then a flurry of activity of 0 and 1s being sent, radiated at the frequency of 1.5 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz for Wi-Fi. But bursts of radiation are troubling to biological systems because we're not used to handling things that are so irregular and so sudden. So there is a physiological problem there.
And so these bursts have a bigger impact on cells than, say, the steadier radiation from radio.
That's right. So we believe that AM and FM and TV radiation, they did have an effect on health, but it was much smaller than what occurs with the generations of cellular phones, 1G, 2G. Well, 1G was essentially using continuous radiation. It's starting with 2G that things became digital. But digitization, from the point of view of human physiology, was an extra threat added to the fact that the radiation was non-natural. In other words, completely different from what is issued by the sun.
I have a question about insects. So I'm just curious if this is true. So I've heard that the higher generations are more dangerous to insects and maybe contributing to some of the, like, say, honeybee extinctions or extinctions of other insects that form kind of the basis of our ecosystem. Is that true, or can you talk about that?
Yes, it's true. the wavelength for your cell phone is about something like this. So when you have a wavelength that's something like this, it penetrates or it injects energy most efficiently in objects that are of comparable size. So, for example, in the standards for protection against non-ionizing radiation, there are frequencies where even industry is more cautious because it corresponds to the full length of the human body. So they want to have more protective radiation limits because it resonates with your body. Now, you take this distance at 1 gigahertz, and now you make it much smaller, say at 10 or 25 gigahertz. Then you have dimensions of the radiation that are comparable to the body of a bee. So the bee will absorb this radiation much more easily than the longer wavelengths. The other thing about bees is that they have a behavioral problem. They don't stay on sidewalks. They have a tendency to go places. So imagine a bee that is relatively near to an antenna, and all of a sudden this antenna becomes active. The bee is very close to the antenna, closer than any human would ever be expected to be, and it is radiated suddenly with a wavelength that is matching its body size. This is really troubling in the sense that it may be invisible to us, but there will be an attrition of flying insects and even of birds as a result of the large number of these antennas that are being deployed.
So this is a real ecological potential disaster. Would that be too strong of a language?
Well, we haven't seen a situation in which bees are completely absent. And, you know, in health and in ecological systems, there's always a big problem in distinguishing the importance of one agent versus the other. Frogs, for example, have disappeared. People thought, oh, they can't tolerate radiation. They can't, but there's also some microorganisms that can attack them. And we know that electromagnetic radiation can, in some cases, be deleterious to the immune system. So we have evidence that electromagnetic radiation completely confuses bees when you put a cell phone in a hive. So this is already an indication. But the newer generations of 5G antennas, of which there are not that many in the world yet, but are currently being deployed, would be likely to have a much larger impact on bee populations.
Okay. I want to do a shift because there's still so much I want to cover. So the community that may be listening to this podcast are people with chronic disease, and they typically have chronic pain, chronic fatigue, unrefreshing sleep, brain fog. They can't think clearly. Many of them have environmental sensitivities. Many of them have what we call electrohypersensitivity. Can you talk about, you talked about how EMF impacts mitochondria and prevents them from making as much energy? I mean, could this be related to this explosion of chronic disease in the world?
Well, there is a definite link between electromagnetic radiation and chronic diseases in the world. And the reason is that when you suppress the production of ATP in oxidative phosphorylation, it's a little bit like pressing a garden hose and restricting the flow of water. And when you press a garden hose, sometimes there's leaks that sprout, elsewhere. And with oxidative phosphorylation, it's exactly the same thing that happens. When you restrict the production of ATP, you increase membrane polarization of the inner membrane, and you make complex 1 and complex 3, those are big molecules within oxidative phosphorylation, more leaky. They will leak more electrons. And these electrons simply end up as reactive oxygen species. And there is an absolutely convincing body of scientific evidence that says that electromagnetic radiation of all sorts increases the amount of reactive oxygen species in living tissues. This is absolutely proven.
And reactive oxygen species cause inflammation, which is basically at the core of most chronic disease.
Yes, most chronic diseases have been connected by physiologists to the generation of reactive oxygen species. As you describe, inflammation has been in the spotlight recently by biochemists who have detailed the mechanisms by which this occurs. But diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and diabetes have all been connected with increases in reactive oxygen species. Yeah. This increase in ROS can be significant in tissues like the pancreas, for example, or electromagnetic radiation can also have impacts on the binding of insulin to receptors in the intracellular space. So we understand how this works. So the idea by industry that there are no mechanisms is patently wrong. There are many mechanisms. There are probably too many mechanisms for us to detail, but we know there are many, many major biological mechanisms on which living systems depend that are affected by the radiation.
Okay. I want to ask, before we get to what people can do to try to lower their own risk, I just wanted to ask you about electrohypersensitivity. So in our community, this is a huge problem. Even listening to a podcast for some people may be very challenging because they get so many symptoms when they're close to anything electrical or high frequency emitting. And I'm just curious how you think about that. Like, why do you think some people are more sensitive than others?
This is a very, very good question. We know that there are some genetic characteristics, what we call genetic variations, particularly genetic variations related to glutathione. For example, certain types of glutathione, if you're homozygous, negative for these types of glutathione. In other words, your body doesn't generate any of this type of glutathione, either from the genes that you receive from your mother or your father, then you're 10 times more likely to be electrosensitive than if you are heterozygous or have two of these genes functioning in your body. So glutathione is one of the major defenses that the organism has against reactive oxygen species. So the connection with genetics is there. But as a physician, you certainly know that not every patient is the same. Every patient has its own vulnerabilities according to how it was constructed originally, how it lived, its habits, and so on. So we die from different diseases because we have different vulnerabilities. And I think it's the same with electrosensitivity. Some people simply have a makeup that makes them more vulnerable. But we do know that electrosensitivity can be triggered as a result of even chemical overexposures and also from electromagnetic overexposures. So there are some triggering events, and this population can be described in various terms. Probably up to 75% of the population actually has some impacts of the presence of electromagnetic radiation in their environment, but the large majority of them are completely unaware. Then there's probably 10% who are aware of the impacts of radiation, but for them, it's not sufficiently disturbing to really notice it or act on it. And then there's 1 to 3% of people for whom the effects are so important that they defend themselves against the radiation. And then there's this 0.1% of the population of people that you'll never see because they have migrated to the countryside or perhaps to a cavern where this radiation is completely absent. And I think it's extremely sad in our society that when these people present themselves in hospitals, their actual situation is completely ignored. Basically, they are sent to psychiatry because obviously industry who has a great deal of expertise in biology and medicine must be right when they claim that these effects are impossible.
Right. And I happen to be a psychiatrist. I'm not sure if you were aware. So, I spent my career really trying to help people figure out what was going on that was coming from some biological cause and what thing maybe was being worsened by worry. So I have a lot of experience
it's
in that.
It's extremely worrisome when you have an affliction that society as a whole is telling you must be in your head. Right. And these people get diagnoses essentially by a process of withdrawing themselves from the radiation, coming back into the radiation and monitoring themselves the symptoms. Most of them will acquire a small instrument that allows them to measure the level of radiation in their environment. And through experience, they learn to avoid the radiation, to avoid the discomfort and the risk. But at the moment, there's only Professor Belpom in Paris who believes that he has some decent indicators in the cerebrospinal fluid that perhaps give some clinically accessible, I would say, indicators to give a firm diagnosis of electrosensitivity. Until now, it's practically all by trial and error, which is a bit sad because a lot of these people spend a lot of money first going to see physicians and then learning about electromagnetic radiation, then shielding their house, and then perhaps moving away. And you move away to a new location, and 1 month later, they install a cell tower near your home. You have to move again. This is a very, very real phenomenon. And that's why the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation issued a statement saying recently that electromagnetic hypersensitivity is an urgent problem that is dramatic, that we need to take care of immediately.
I'm just wondering, maybe you can forward me a reference from that organization that I could share with the people listening. I want to, just in our last few minutes, I want to move into, so you've kind of hinted at how people can figure out what's going on, and it's really to move away, move closer, move away, move closer, and notice how they feel, and also to perhaps get a measuring device. People always ask me, well, how far should I be from this or that? And I usually say, you know what, you have to measure because waves are always augmenting and blocking each other out. And you can't, there's no rule of thumb. You have to actually do the measurement to see what you're being exposed to.
You're right. An instrument is ideal. But of course, becoming an expert or understanding electromagnetic radiation, both at low frequencies and at high frequencies, and how to protect against them is not very, very easy. It's a little bit technical, but there are rules of thumb.
Okay. For example, what are some of them? Yeah.
If you have a child, make sure he's not sleeping in close proximity to a baseboard heater that's electrically driven, for example. This is elementary. If you have an instrument, monitor the electromagnetic fields, the magnetic fields in the immediate environment of this child. So we have such good evidence about doubling or tripling or more of the rate of leukemia in children associated with these fields that it's very negligent not to take it into account. And in fact, there's the former epidemiologist of Washington State, Samuel Milham, who believes that there was no substantial amount of leukemia in children before electrification. We know that there is leukemia in humans in later ages, but his view is that the peak that we see in children is probably due to electrification. Now, when it comes to telecommunications, well, don't use your cell phone against your head. Spare your brain. Use the speaker phone. And if you like to have the sound directly, privately in your ears, use what is called an air tube. In other words, if you have an air tube that goes to a device that is connected to your phone, you will have no radiation near your head, and you will be spared the very high peaks of exposure that are associated with the emissions of the phone. As well, wire your home. As opposed to having Wi-Fi in the home, have the courage to pass these internet cables that give you more secure and faster and more stable connection as opposed to relying on Wi-Fi. And if you absolutely have to use Wi-Fi, turn it off when you don't use it and buy a unit that can be attenuated for its emissions, because most units are designed to cover large volumes of space. And if you live in a small apartment, you don't need that. And if you've been in a small apartment with a cell phone, usually, if you look at the number of base stations that you can access from a single apartment,
it's huge. Yeah.
Huge. That means that all of this radiation is going through the walls and affecting this single tenant while it's completely unnecessary. So wiring is a very, very good solution.
And I get asked that exact question all the time from people that live in apartments. And they say, well, I can turn my router off. I can turn my phone off. But what about, how do I protect myself from all of my neighbors? You can't. Okay,
and this
darn.
is a grave
I was hoping
injustice.
For a different answer.
It's a grave injustice. Well, the solution is that you could always put aluminum foil on all your walls. But this requires a little bit of skill because aluminum foil can reflect radiation away from your home, but it can also reflect radiation that is within your home. But a fair number of people have to adopt solutions of that type to protect themselves because they cannot tolerate radiation levels that are essentially produced by their neighbors. Right. And the Canadian standards for radiofrequency radiation are around 4.5 million microwatts per square meter. So microwatts means tiny fraction of a watt that is incident in a square meter of surface. But there are some people who are sensitive to levels of 5 microwatts per square meter. These people cannot survive in typical environments. They can't go to the grocery store. They can't go to the bank. They can't go downtown unless they are protected. And these people are so embarrassed by their condition that they have a tendency to hide. They simply don't go where they feel that they're not wanted. I would encourage...
I was just going to say, how can they protect themselves? Say you live alone and you have to get groceries. Is there anything you can do?
There's a person called Anne Astor. Anne, A-N-N-E, A-S-T-E-R. This is her name. And she has a website where she describes how you can build clothing that protects you against this radiation. So she tells you where to buy the cloth, how to assemble it. And she goes around perfectly normally in Montreal, in the convention center, dressed in a suit that makes her look like an astronaut.
I was
And
going to
it
say it'd be
takes,
like a bee suit, like a beekeeper suit.
yes, it
Yeah.
takes an enormous courage to do this because you're instantly fingered as an alien of sorts.
Yeah.
Practically all electrosensitive people, uh, either they have some tolerance to the radiation and they know how long they can stay at a given location without having, substantial symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
uh, or they go away from these locations completely. Very few are willing to make the statement that it's a little bit like a lot of people drink bottled water now because they feel that the water coming out of the tap, well, it has chlorine in it, and it may have a number of other things in it that you don't want. So they're looking for purified water. So this is a symptom of the fact that we have an environmental problem. These people who use these suits want to make the statement that we are doing something to our environment that is unhealthy. And these people are the canaries in the mine. They are the people who feel the radiation. Most of us don't. So in a sense, they are rendering a great service in that they are warning us of something that is impending on our health.
I want to ask you about a few other approaches. One is there's people who sell little patches that you put on your cell phone or that you attach to your hydrometer at home. Like one of them has rare earths in it. And I haven't been able to get any information, so I just thought I've just been waiting to ask you about these kind of products.
Usually these products have websites where you have a person who's going to tell you how wonderful it is for very vague reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience with these things is that save your money.
Okay.
Any threat to health creates an industry that takes advantage of the situation. So to protect yourself against radiation, the solution is to protect yourself from the source, either from distance or you can attenuate the source. Some people have these meters that are communicating meters, that are smart meters.
Right.
They can place some shields, some reflectors near these meters and thereby reduce their exposure. It doesn't take much radiation to disable a really electrosensitive person.
Right. What about grounding? Does that help at all? Just going out every day and putting your feet on the earth or making sure that your bed or your house is grounded?
This is a very contentious issue. And the reason why is that the ground itself is passing currents that are generated in great part by the electrical power system. In other words, in a city, current goes through a hot wire into the device. And ideally, it would go back to the utility through a grounding wire. But in fact, 60% of the current goes back to the earth, the physical earth below our feet. And because of the devices that we have in our homes, these ground currents are not pure sine waves. They are what we call dirty electricity.
Got it.
As a result of this, it's not entirely safe unless you know that the grounding in your area is non-contaminated. It's not necessarily a good idea to ground either your body or some shields. You have to find out with instruments. We have gone to this extent where utilities have used the ground as part of their electrical system, and they have not only corroded pipes in the ground as a result, but they have made the ground itself, connection to the ground, unhealthy.
So basically you're saying the best way to protect yourself is to turn off as much as possible,
Yes.
Don't sleep close to stuff. I know in my house I call them clickers, but they turn off all the circuits at night that I don't need. All the electrical circuits.
You have that.
I have that.
You're privileged.
Yeah, yeah, I've had that for 20 years and I turn my cell phone off at night and I only turn my Wi-Fi router on when it's needed, like when I have guests in the house, and the rest of the time everything's hardwired.
Great. You're an example to all of your listeners.
Yeah, but they think I'm crazy. That's why I was so keen to have you on today because I've done blogs on this. It's on my website, and people email me and say, Ellie, it doesn't make sense. We're living in this all the time and we're fine.
Yes, you're living in cigarette smoke and you don't die. You're living in pollution and you don't die immediately. And all
Right.
of these diseases that are chronic diseases are things that happen very, very slowly. So this electromagnetic radiation may not make you sick at all, may not make you sick immediately, but
Mhm.
it may make you sick earlier than you would have been otherwise from these diseases, in particular of the nervous system. You've heard also that fertility in humans is declining enormously. We have
Yeah.
great evidence that this radiation is dangerous to sperm and to eggs. We have
Wow.
the explanation for this in our pocket, but there is such a tradition of blaming other things like chemicals that nobody, including the World Health Organization, wants to listen. The evidence is overwhelming that
Wow.
electromagnetic radiation affects fertility.
So I have one other question. When you have your phone on airplane mode, is it safe or are we still at risk? That's a
Well,
personal question because mine is on airplane mode most of the time if it's not off.
obviously, the aviation industry thinks it's better if your
Hmm.
phone is in airplane mode because they require you to have it in this mode when they take off so as not to interfere with telecommunications or remote sensing. But have you noticed how computers initially, in the old times, we used to have a operating system called DOS.
Hmm.
DOS, disk operating system, was very simple. You typed in commands, and the computer would react. Then came more sophisticated operating systems with like Windows, where the computer started doing a lot of things on its own. In other
Hmm.
words, you didn't quite seem to know what the computer was doing. And in later years, there's all these updates that come through the internet over which you have no control. And now you're saving your data in the cloud. So the personal computer has evolved from a personal device under your control to a device under the control of everybody else. I think that the cell phone is going in exactly the same direction. You put your phone in airplane mode, it's not a guarantee that there will be no emissions at all from it, you know.
Wow. Okay.
So
So off is best.
off is best,
Okay.
absolutely. But manufacturers are in the business of creating an object that is as active as useful as possible. So they have no qualms about turning on your phone when you don't want it, putting data or extracting data from your phone without your knowledge. And I believe that these bots, these robots, will be increasing in the future. And of course, the more applications you have on your phone, the more likely this is to happen. So as you point out,
Okay.
turning it off or removing the battery are final solutions.
My last question is, where can people get more information? So maybe they haven't believed me, maybe they won't even believe you, but maybe we've planted a seed and sometime in the future they're going to search out information. What are some good sites they could go to?
Well, you could go to the International Commission of Biological Effects on
Hmm.
Electromagnetic Radiation. This is ICBE EMF.org.
Hmm.
Or you could go to the Environmental Health Trust. This is a site that is put together by people who have been in this business for a long time. The Environmental Health Trust will give you recommendations on how to protect yourself and some literature to helping to prove that the effects are entirely real.
Okay. I think that's a great place to end. I really, really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you so much.
And Ellie, you were right all along.
In what way?
In doing all the things that you are doing to protect yourselves and in trying to instruct others to do the same.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining me on the Dr. Eleanor Stein Podcast. I hope you are taking away new strategies and ideas to improve your health and a renewed sense of hope. Join me, Dr. Eleanor Stein, for our next episode. Can't wait? Check out my website for a wealth of free resources.